Hello, Sages. My name is Sharon Bachman, and I would like to thank Brent and Meredith for asking me to present in their Mesh from Soup to Nuts session. I'm going to be taking you on a whirlwind tour of the FDA approval process for biomaterials. So let me get out of the way and let you know that I have nothing to disclose. You are a brilliant surgeon, and you have a great new idea for Konbu mesh. This is the kelp alternative. It's the marine hernia mesh that isn't just for seaweed salad anymore. So you figured out how to create this novel cellulose and carbohydrate rich mesh out of a renewable resource. Now what? Well, that's the objective of this talk. We're going to detail the regulatory process to legally bring a new medical device to market in the United States. So what is a medical device? Well, everything you see pictured on this slide is a medical device. So it can be an instrument, machine, an implant, but it has to be recognized in the official national formulary, intended for use in diagnosis of disease, or the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, and it is intended to affect the structure or function of humans. And there is a long list of legislative acts which give the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, the power to oversee this process. So if you are interested in device development, I highly recommend looking at the FDA website, which is very rich in resources. But what is the FDA's job? Well, they do need to protect the public from potential injury from bad devices, faulty design, things that are dangerous, but they also need to make sure that safe and effective products are efficiently getting to the public so everybody can get a mesh. How do they do that? Well, we're going to talk about these 4 steps to market, but first let's just make clear that marketing is not the regulation of the practice of medicine. The FDA is not telling us what to use and when to use it. However, they are regulating the sale, distribution, and promotion of medical products. So the first step is to look at our device, classify it, and understand the applicable controls. And this chart shows the 3 categories of medical device risk. The device classification depends on the intended use of the device and the indications for use. So class 1 is the lowest risk, which presents minimal potential for harm to the patient. Class 2 is moderate risk, which is higher risk than class 1, and due to that risk has a higher level of regulatory control. And class 3 are the greatest risk devices which sustain or support life, can be implanted, or present potential unreasonable risk of injury or illness. And as the risk goes up, the regulatory control of the devices becomes more stringent. So class 1 risk is subject to what are called general controls. And these are the basic regulatory requirements that any device in the US must comply with. And if you only have general controls, it's usually because there is a low risk of harm to the user. And general controls do apply to all 3 levels, but class 1 only needs this particular control. Now, companies still have to follow good manufacturing practices. They have to register their manufacturing establishments and label their devices accordingly. So the FDA is still keeping an eye on them. Class 2 risk, it falls under both the general and also special controls. And special controls are usually device specific. So these are devices that could cause moderate risk of harm, and therefore the FDA wants to see mandatory performance standards. They might want to see registries, special types of labeling, some pre-market data requirements, post-market surveillance, and there might be special guidelines and FDA guidance documents for these. And we'll talk about the 510K in a moment. Class 3, these are the most potentially dangerous devices with highest risk of harm, and they are subject to a pre-market approval application, which we will also discuss. Now, some devices that aren't that harmful might be a class 3 at first because there's just insufficient information to make a good determination. And so they might be reclassified to class 1 or 2 depending on predicate devices, which we'll discuss. But otherwise, these are devices that might have unreasonable risk of injury and need the most stringent regulatory process. So now that we've discussed the classifications, we need to prepare the correct pre-market submission. And there is, as you can see, about 8 different pathways to go down here. Now, the ones that are most applicable to us in our surgical device development are the pre-market notification, which is commonly known as the 510K, and the PMA, the pre-market approval. For class 1 devices, if you make an instrument, you might be exempt if it's low risk. If you need to gather data for your device, you might need to do an investigational device exemption where both the FDA and the local IRB approve. So there's a whole bunch of different classes, but we're going to focus on the 510K and the PMA because that's the most common. So a 510K is the paperwork required when you are introducing a device into commercial distribution for the first time in the United States. So to sell this device, you need the approval from the FDA 90 days prior to offering it for sale. And if you change the device, you might need a new 510K. So what's interesting about the 510K is that you can say that your device is similar or has equivalence to a substantially equivalent device, which is known as the predicate, and any legally marketed device can be used as the predicate. But until you get your order saying that your device has substantial equivalence, you still can't proceed to market. So a substantial equivalence is a way of saying that this new device is just as safe and effective as the comparable device. So it has the same intended use and technology, or it has the same intended use, has some different technology that doesn't raise the question of safety and effectiveness, and that you're showing the FDA through some data that that's true. And a 510K is a letter. It's not a form. It's very structured, just like an H&P. And you can see this is what the FDA offers as an outline for your 510K. And then again, a very short 510K example that they've made. Once you submit your 510K, then the FDA is going to go down this decision-making flowchart that they publish until they determine whether you have proven substantial equivalence, and you will get approval in the form of your letter that says you may go to market. And so for any device, they have to have this letter on file and publicly available. If there's no substantial equivalent, then you need to take another track. So a predicate device doesn't have to be identical. You can try resubmitting another 510K with new data. You can request a class 1 or class 2 designation through that de novo process. Or you might have to go ahead and submit a PMA. So the PMA is the most stringent type of the marketing application. And that's because of the risk associated with class 3 devices. So the FDA wants to make sure that there's good science, that there's good regulatory review, but they are still mandated to be least burdensome with the level of evidence. So you don't have to have necessarily a randomized control study. As you can see, there's significantly more on the outline for the PMA. But once you've got your pre-market submission, you get everything together, you pay your fee. And please note that the fee for your PMA is significantly higher than the 510K, along the order of $200,000 plus more. So you can see there's a significant financial incentive to try to stay to the 510K pathway. After you submit, the FDA will review your application within a specified period of time, and there might be interactive review with the staff. So there are government officials who are part of the device panels. There's also some representatives. For us, it's general and plastic surgery, and hopefully you recognize the name of Frank Lewis, our prior ABS executive director, and you might even know Adrian Park, who is a SAGES member. So finally, once you're approved, you have to comply with regulatory surveillance, which is post-market. Unfortunately, it mostly is adverse events. There isn't a lot of ongoing surveillance of how devices are doing and if they're working well. But there are regulations that you have to report if there's serious failures. For example, we saw this with some of the gynecologic meshes. The system isn't perfect. The mandatory post-marketing is not really well set up to capture all adverse events. Some people think the fast track kind of decreases the incentive to do good clinical studies ahead of time. This can take a while, and the assumption of equivalence may not be sound. And you get devices that are kind of linked to these serial generations of predicates. So our kombu mesh, we did some preclinical testing. We don't really have a lot of clinical data, but do we need data? And are we going to get that 510K, or are we going to have to go through the PMA process? So if we look up hernia mesh in the product classification database, we get 46 different sections. But if we look at absorbable mesh, that will take us here, where we can see that we are in device class 2. That's great. We can do a 510K if we can prove equivalence. And we're not exempt from a 510K because we're class 2, not class 1. But if we click through, we can find the names of the other devices we can try to show our predicates. So you can use the database to try to link yourself to target your substantial equivalence. So finally, to conclude, on our little flow sheet here, you can see what we want to try to do for our moderate class 2 risk is submit that 510K. And if the FDA does not accept our data, they might send us down that PMA pathway, which has more stringency. So I hope you enjoyed this brief review of the rather complex approval process, and I hope you enjoy the meeting.